determine the performance phases in golf, we analyzed two main mental performance related criteria. We examined the golfer's information processing and the levels of consistency and behavior during their pre- and post-shot routines. We found that the golfers demonstrated very systematic and predictable patterns, as well in their information processing as in their behavioral consistency during their pre- and post-shot routines. When we studied competing golfers, we determined that the largest amount of information was processed in the beginning of the pre-shot routines and at the end of the post-shot routines, while the least information processing occurred during their execution phase. At the beginning of the routines during the recovery phase, the golfers would talk to their caddy, opponents or crowds. They would sometimes eat or drink something, or they would take notice of the weather circumstances like the wind condition. During the information phase, the golfers would collect information on a wide variety of variables like the wind, the lie of the ball, the distance to the target and so on. Then during the confirmation phase, the golfers would become more focused and pay attention only to a smaller number of variables, like the physical setup and the target location. We would then see the golfers bring their head down towards the ball during the trust phase while quieting their minds. During the execution phase, the putt or swing execution required a minimal amount of information processing, which we call automaticity. Then the golfer's attention span would open up again a little during the evaluation phase, where they collected information about the quality and result of the putt or swing. During the reorientation phase, we observed that the golfers would process increasingly more information when they paid attention to a larger number of things while walking away from the scene. Whether the clubs would be put back in the golf bag, or the golfers would be talking again to their opponents or to their caddies. At the end of the routine during the recovery period, the golfers demonstrated often the most amount of information processing again, when they would walk towards the next ball location and enjoy the environment, or they would stretch some or use some relaxed breathing techniques, or they would pay attention to the weather circumstances. The shape of the Hourglass Performance model was also substantiated by our research when we examined specific behavioral patterns in golfers during their pre- and post-shot routines. We found that all the golfers demonstrated much more variability in their behavioral patterns at the beginning and at the end of their routines compared to their behavior closer towards the moment of execution. We found, for example, much more variability in time use for the functional phases in the beginning and at the end of the golfer's routines, compared to the golfer's time use for the functional performance phases closer towards the moment of the putt or the swing execution. Most variety in the time intervals was found for the golfer's recovery phases. Sometimes the golfers would have to walk short or long distances after their swings, depending on the ball location. During putting, we would also observe large time differences for the recovery phases, which would often depend on how long they had to wait for their opponent's turns for their putts on the putting green. During the golfer's information phases, we would still find a relatively large variability in the golfer's time use. This would often depend on the difficulty of the swing or putt situation. For example, for difficult swing or putt situations, the golfers would normally take more time to process all the needed information, or they would take more practice swings or strokes before they would step up to the ball, compared to those time periods that they would use for the relatively easier swing or putts. However, the time that was used by the golfers for the final setup during the confirmation phase would be much more consistent, no matter if the swing or putt situation was difficult or easy. So for example, in our study we found that the golfers demonstrated very high consistent patterns in the number of glances for the physical setup and for the target location during their performance, regardless if the swing or putt was difficult or not. Then finally, the highest levels of consistency for the golfers' time patterns were found during the trust phases of the pre-shot routines. During our analysis of the post-shot routines, we found evidence of similar time patterns, where the golfers demonstrated more consistent time intervals directly after the putt or swing execution when they evaluated the results of the putt or the swing. This in comparison to the time patterns during the reorientation phase, where the golfers demonstrated more variability in the time use, when, for example, they would stay for relatively short or sometimes long periods of time at the location where they had executed their putt or swing. Most variety in the time intervals, however, were found again for the golfers' recovery phases, when they, for example, would either walk short or long distances between consecutive swings, or they had to wait either short or long time periods before it was their turn to putt. So our research found evidence of more information processing and more variability in behavior in the beginning of the golfers' pre-shot routines and at the end of the golfers' post-shot routines, compared to those moments close before and after the putt or swing executions. While pondering how these results could be put in a simple but useful mental performance assessment and training model, an hourglass shape seemed to be perfectly suited. In the beginning of the pre-shot routine, where we would find the most information processing and the most variability, that would be the beginning and the wider part of the hourglass. The execution, where we found the least information processing and least variability, which we call automaticity, would be the middle and the narrow part of the hourglass. While the end of the post-shot routine, where we found again the most information processing and the most variability in the behavior of the golfer, would be the end and the wider part of the hourglass. The Hourglass Performance model was born.